Hi there, and welcome back to another painting process video of my gouache flower from my flower calendar 2019. Today's flower is a Calla, which I painted for the month of June. While I was editing this video, I saw that it could be a good video to talk about the painting process of all my gouache flowers and how I usually paint with gouache. Just keep in mind that what I'm about to share is my personal way of working with gouache. There isn't a right or wrong way, but keep in mind that my way might not work for you, which is totally fine, but maybe I will be able to give you some tips on how to use gouache. I first start with mixing colors and looking for the right color shade. I usually like to use small amount of different colors to mix together and find the color combination that I like. Unless I have to paint a large area, I never put too much paint and I would rather mix the same colors again, not because I'm afraid of using too much paint, but because I don't mind too much if the colors I mixed before don't match the color I mixed again. I also don't mind too much about my color swatches. I always do color swatches before start painting because the colors that dry on paper are always different from the colors I see on my mixing surface, so I never rely on the colors I see on the palette. If you are new to gouache, I would recommend you to wait for the color swatches to dry because usually gouache dry darker. But personally, depending on the illustration, I don't always wait for the color swatches to dry because I don't mind too much if the colors I'm mixing don't look exactly the colors I want, as long as they are bright and they don't look dirty. This is also because I like to work with different shades of the same color to blend together, so that's why I like to use many different colors so that I can create different shades of the same color. I also don't use pure color right off the tube, but I always create my personal color combination. Mainly, the way I like to work with gouache is to use it both thin and opaque. I usually like to start painting with the thin and transparent gouache for the first layer and then overlay more transparent layer to reach more opacity, like I did for all the flowers from my flower calendar, but I used a more opaque and thick gouache for painting the leaves, which I will get into details later. When using gouache thin, I play a lot with water and paint on paper. What I do sometimes is to put blob of paint on paper and then blend it with the brush on the area I'm painting, and also by removing the excess of paint and water. I play a lot with blending colors when the paint is quite wet, because it's easier to blend colors if you use water rather than when you use gouache very thick and very dry. With gouache, I like to work on watercolor papers that absorb well the paint and allows me to overlay several layers of paint without the paint being lifted up from the paper. But the main thing about painting with transparent gouache is that it's very easy to overlay several layers of paint without lifting up the paint underneath, because as you may know, gouache can be reactivated with water, both on your mixing surface and on paper. But it's harder to overlay layers with opaque gouache. It's not impossible, but I would say you have to use a good quality gouache and use the right paper, which I still haven't figured out what kind of paper is best to use. Probably it has to be 100% cotton to have the best absorbency, so that it absorbs a lot of paint and a lot of water, so that the paint doesn't get lifted up easily, but I'm not 100% sure. If you know, please leave a comment down below. Anyway, I always start by painting the color base and then add the colored outlines and add all the details on my illustrations, which I did the same things for my gouache flowers. adding details and outline is just my personal preference and personal style, because outlines give more defined shapes to everything I paint and helps the flower to stand out more and be more defined. For me, which I also think you enjoy watching, adding details is the most relaxing and satisfying and rewarding part of my entire painting process. It's funny because every time I paint the color base, I always think it doesn't look anything special and it looks even bad and ugly. But every time I know that as soon as I add details and outlines, the painting completely changes and comes to life. So for most of my gouache flowers, I painted the flower part with transparent gouache while I painted the leaves more opaque. So when painting with opaque gouache, I kind of do the same thing by blending colors next to each other with the brush. In my case, most of the time the colors don't have to be perfectly blended because I always go on top with details. I place bold color strokes next to each other and then blend everything together with the brush, but I never use gouache completely dry and opaque. I always add some water to help blending the colors. It's easier to work this way and it will still dry very opaque. But the thing about painting with opaque gouache, I don't usually work with many layers for different reasons, especially when overlaying opaque layers of the same color. It can happen that the second layer will dry darker. So I try to paint the first layer right at the first time, because if you do it right, when you want to fix some mistakes, it's easy to mess up and it will be harder to blend colors again. So if I don't use gouache thin, I just paint one layer and then go on top of with the details. So I don't build up layers as I do with thin gouache if I know I'm going to paint those certain area with opaque and thick gouache. So I prepare and decide beforehand how opaque I want my layer to be. I think the reason why I painted the flower more thin and the leaves more opaque is to give more contrast to the painting. Another thing, when I add all the thin lines and fine details on my flowers, I don't simply paint without thinking about the direction of my lines, but I always follow the veins of the flowers and of the leaves in order to give a more tri-dimensional and more realistic look to my flowers, which also helps to give more flow and movement to the flowers, because flowers are living creatures and they are not static objects. If you ever want to paint flowers more realistically, my tips would be to pay attention and look at the veins of the petals and of the leaves to give a more realistic look rather than paint the lines straight, which the flower will look more flat. You can paint the lines straight. It's simply a different style and a more graphic style. And these same tips you can apply when sketching flowers. Last thing, I think about contrast, light and shadows. For example, for the parts that are behind, I place a darker color to add shadow. And for the parts that are in front, I paint a lighter color, and not meaning I'm using black to make the color darker. I never use pure black, but I add a darker tone of the same color for the shadow. Just keep in mind that although my flowers are quite realistic and botanical, this is my personal way and personal style of painting flowers, which is not super realistic, but is also not the style I'm looking for. For example, when painting botanical illustrations, you never add outlines because outline automatically make the flower look more graphic. And yeah, I think that's it. I hope you found this video helpful and interesting. As I mentioned it before in another video of my gouache flowers, I'm not going to do the voiceover for all of them, but I'm only going to do voiceover if I have something interesting to say about the flowers. And I think I still have 7 flowers to share the painting process. I'm sorry, I'm so slow at editing videos. And a quick reminder that my flower calendar featuring this flower and other 12 flowers is still available to purchase on my Etsy shop, which I will leave the link to my shop in the description and at the end of the video if you want to check my flower calendar. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye! Thank you.